Did that T.Rex just say Sega? Awesome. Alright, this is Jurassic Park, the video game, and Jurassic Park was a pretty solid movie. I don't think I need to tell you that, but hey, if I do, Jurassic Park was a pretty solid movie. I mean, it has some of the best effects that still hold up this side of Star Wars, so of course it was going to get a game back in the day, and it got a lot of games. Like, a lot of games. Seriously, pretty much every console and every handheld, and even some computers got Jurassic Park in some form or another. And sadly, back in the day I played most of them. And, while this is certainly me working off memory here, this is the only one you really want to play. Now, the story of this game is kind of, sort of like that of Jurassic Park, but not really. Essentially, a T-Rex has gotten loose, destroyed your car, and as Dr. Alan Grant, you have to go find your way off the island. And just as an aside as to why this game isn't all that great as a storytelling medium, there's nothing about humanity being the real monsters here, or awesome sweeping shots of dinosaurs, or really anything outside of side-scrolling shooting action. But to be fair, this game knows what it's trying to be, and it's that. It's not trying to tell you a story, it's trying to be a Jurassic Park run-and-gun game. And to be fair, it does it relatively well. This is still a licensed movie title, but in that regard, it's actually pretty decent. Now, as Dr. Grant, you can run, you can jump, you can swap to your various weapons, including gas grenades, a taser, which requires to be charged and is like the least effective thing ever, as well as a tranquilizer dart gun. You can also get jumped on by tiny little dinosaurs, which are too close to actually shoot. Yeah. They're a little bit tricky to deal with, unfortunately. And you can't really go around spamming your gas grenades and hitting them at a distance either, because you actually have to save those for the bigger dinosaurs. Because even at the start, this little Triceratops here, if you don't hit him with a gas grenade, you basically just get thrown around, and you can't get past him until he decides to throw you behind him. Did I mention this was a licensed title? But again, for a movie game, it's still pretty good. And the last thing Dr. Grant can do is ride on a little dinghy and collect a bunch of gas cans or drown a lot, because it's the worst level. Or, and I'm just proposing an alternative here, you could play as the Raptor, because as the clever girl she is, she skips all of that and doesn't have to do that level. Unfortunately, the trade-off for having the Raptor as a playable character is they had to take out Samuel L. Jackson, Newman, and Jeff Goldblum. Which, but Raptor, and Raptor's pretty awesome. And the interesting thing is, Raptor actually ends up playing completely differently than Grant, because it can't use weapons. It's not that advanced yet. I mean, it doesn't learn how to use doors until the last level. But because you don't have weapons, all you have is your biting attack, which actually makes very short work of those tiny dinosaurs, which don't even bother you. And as an added bonus, when you eat them, you get bonus health, which is great, because unlike Grant, who gets a bunch of health kits, you get tiny little bits of chicken, which do pretty much nothing. Other than that, you have a karate kick that would make Mr. Miyagi himself proud, as well as a very impressive jumping ability. Seriously, this jump can decimate levels, both vertically and horizontally. And that's why the Raptor's levels are designed slightly differently than Dr. Grant's, because of course, with that jump, she'd basically tear his levels to shreds. Granted, they are very similar in level designs, they do try to take into account the Raptor's additional abilities. And not just that, because right off the bat, pretty much with the exception of less health pickups, you'd kind of say the Raptor is just straight out better, and to a degree you're right, because again, you don't get the worst level in the game. But conversely, unlike just fighting dinosaurs like Grant has to do, the Raptor has to fight a few dinosaurs, mainly just the spitters, but also the park personnel, who are equipped with the same loadout that Grant has access to. And this means you have to play things very smart and basically hit your opponents before they see you, or else you get gas bombed to death very, very quickly. I think the Raptor's the way to go, but the nice thing is this game does like to give you two different ways to play, and that's definitely appreciated. Now, in terms of overall control, taking into the fact that, once again, it is a movie title, it's not too bad, but it does have a lot of issues. For one thing, the controls are very sluggish. It can sometimes take up to like a second for your character to actually respond to what you're telling it to do. And the hit detection, especially with the platforms, which in some situations can make or break your survival here, is spotty at best. Seriously, you can basically stand off the platforms in some cases and then make a jump. Other times, while you're pretty much on the edge, you'll still fall through. It doesn't happen often, but there are some really tight jumps that kind of depend on whether or not the spotty collision with the platforms wants to work with you. Again, doesn't happen often, but it does happen. And that's the basic gist of the gameplay to Jurassic Park. They try and balance out the difficulty between the two characters, which is really interesting given that both end up sort of having their own completely unique experiences, which, to be fair, they are thematically more or less identical. Still, it feels like the additional character keeps the game fresh, and that's definitely appreciated, despite the fact that the gameplay does have many hiccups that can end up costing you a life and forcing you to start over, and there are no checkpoints, which in certain situations can get really frustrating. The overall presentation to Jurassic Park is, I'd say, on the higher end of medium. Visually, it looks quite impressive, although the sprite work does feel a little bit busy. I would also say that this is just something that kind of bothered me a little bit, and that is that the raptor appears a little bit green. And I imagine this is simply because it's a digitized 3D model. Overall, it's not a big deal or anything, but it is something that I took notice of, and it did feel a little bit weird in certain situations where other characters and dinosaurs didn't have that effect on them. And half the time you end up completely ignoring the backgrounds and visuals just to try and make sure you make a jump. And overall, the backgrounds aren't the most memorable, but they are well made. But overall, visually, Jurassic Park does its job pretty well, although you won't be paying too much attention to it because dinosaurs will be trying to eat you frequently and often. Audio-wise, this game kind of more or less falls apart. I will give it credit for the awesome yelling effect you hear every single human make, as well as Grant when he faceplants a lot. I like that sound effect. Oh! It was good. It was good. But the music is more or less entirely forgettable with the exception of maybe one track, and that's really unfortunate because the Genesis could at the end of the day output some decent music. I will say, however, that while the music is for the most part completely unremarkable in terms of how memorable it is or how really good it is, I will say it does make very good use of the abrasiveness of the Sega Genesis sound chip, and that shows that, if nothing else, it was very well produced. Now, if you want a copy of Jurassic Park, well, you've got a lot of options because, again, it was released on everything back in the day. And this was the 90s, so while they all have the same name and they all have the exact same box art, they were all completely different games. And once again, point to the 90s for having different games instead of us all getting the exact same game across every system. That said, if you want the Sega Genesis Jurassic Park, which again is pretty much the only console released Jurassic Park you want to play, it's not very expensive. You can get it for like $5, $10, $15 in a pinch maybe, but that said, that's pushing it a bit. The game is really dirt cheap. And the thing is, this is the only Jurassic Park game that was good enough to receive a direct sequel in the much paradoxically named Jurassic Park Rampage Edition, which is the sequel to this game, although it is more or less more of this game, which isn't necessarily a bad thing. And the nice thing is, the sequel is also dirt cheap. So, you know, if you like this game, you're probably going to like the sequel as well. There was also a somewhat similar game called Jurassic Park 2: The Chaos Continues on the Super Nintendo, which was a run and gun style game, but you don't get to play as a raptor, and from what I remember, it was bland and not fun to play. So maybe skip that one, or, you know, wait for me to get a copy at some point and then I'll tell you whether or not to skip it, but right now I'm going to tell you to skip that one. Basically, this is the one Jurassic Park game you want to play unless you can get the arcade game, but in the end, Jurassic Park is a movie license tie-in. But that said, it's certainly one of the better ones. It's not an excellent game, but it's definitely playable, but not without its issues and frustrations. But it's also one of the few games where you can play as a velociraptor that can karate kick everything. At its price, I would say that's worth it in and of itself.